And if they are told that the game is to test their sports strategic intelligence, white men's performance it remains unaffected, black men's performance dips. So we can see that what we think and believe we can do, those beliefs can be very easily modified or shaken by having the wrong kind of input. And I guess one thing you might want to kind of take on already is the thought that when we're in such situations, thinking to ourselves that these cues might have this effect on us, and how to kind of mentally prepare for, say, walking into a room where the interviewees are mostly or all men might be useful. Now, these two phenomena, implicit bias and stereotype threat, interact. So, implicit bias is an unconscious state that makes other people judge you harshly, judge you unfairly, judge you negatively. Those situations can trigger stereotype threat. And similarly, in situations where they interact more often, are the obvious, I think you know what I'm going to be putting up next, or the obvious, what are now called some of the protected characteristics under the Discrimination Act. Race, gender, sex, having a foreign accent, sexual orientation, age, and physical disability. I don't know why, I'm sure mental disability didn't help. But, so if you think about somebody who has a combination of these elements in their personal biography or as part of their identity, you can see how discrimination can, at certain junction points, become amplified by somebody, say, being both of a certain race and of a certain gender. So the hierarchy, so it's not just a dichotomy of, say, white and non-white people, but there are hierarchies that are subtle and not so subtle, where, say, even within a race situation, being a woman on top of belonging to a particular race might have additional deleterious effects on the person, the way in which the person is assessed, and the way in which the person performs due to stereotype threat. So, these mechanisms can be very damaging in a variety of ways, even though there are good evolutionary reasons for their being there in the first place. So what Richard and I were really interested in was the question of, well, what can we do about it? And there are two very broad things we can do. One, we can challenge stereotypes. So when I read stories to my son, and it's a fairy tale, and it says that the princess was both beautiful and clever, I sometimes omit the beautiful and say, oh, she's the princess. Or if you look at, well, children's literature is a very obvious example where there's been a lot of work of kind of producing counter-stereotypical stories, say fairy tales, of princesses who rescue princes and slay dragons and wear paper bags instead of beautiful dresses. So one thing we can do very actively and very easily is challenge the stereotypes. So if you go to the movies with friends, and the movie is about a man who is fighting with another man over a woman, as 90% of Hollywood productions are in one way or another, that could be something you might want to talk about. Or if you're, especially I think in social situations, this came up when we did this talk last year. Students talked a lot about how there's a lot of sexist, in particular we talked about sexist, but also racist remarks being made as kind of banter, and then when you try to challenge them, then people just accuse you of not having a sense of humour. But I think challenging the stereotypes doesn't mean that you don't have a sense of humour, and can be done, I think, in a very, very effective way in any situation, really. And the other thing that we've tried to do in the department is mitigate the effects of implicit bias and stereotype threat, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So, one thing we've discussed a lot with colleagues and we've tried to do ourselves is to change the stereotype. So, I've often heard students read a paper written by a woman, and you know how we usually talk about authors, we only mention the surname, so they say, oh, as he said, and you say, no, it's not he, it's a woman, she's called Sheila, and she works in this place, and I met her, and she's very nice. So one thing we can do is make sure that when we talk about, say, a female philosopher, it is obvious that this particular philosopher is a woman, and also by increasing the representation of women in reading lists, in conferences, in research seminar invitees, and by making the conscious decision to try and cite women more, because we have evidence, it's Kieran Healy, isn't it? From the sociologist called Kieran Healy, who noticed, well, who documented the fact that when people cite other people in their own papers, they tend to undercite women and cite men a lot more. Some things that have been demonstrated to not be helpful is, for example, just telling yourself, well, don't be biased, or telling yourself, I'm not biased. I think that the evidence that Richard was giving earlier demonstrates pretty clearly that even people who have no intention of being biased, even people who are card-carrying liberals, egalitarians, feminists, will still have, or might still suffer from implicit bias when they're making decisions, such as hiring, promotion, and so on. And also, just kind of self-backpadding by saying, oh, I've been in that situation where I was on an interview panel and we ended up hiring a woman, so obviously I haven't got any problems here, so I just don't need to worry about this. That also doesn't work, because what we're interested in is in the cases where the bias kicked in and prevented the best candidate from being hired in a particular context. Do you want to skip it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So things that work a little bit is making sure that women sit on hiring committees to mitigate stereotype threat and to maybe possibly make things more gender fair. However, again, as we've said, women are as likely as men to suffer from implicit bias, so there's no reason to think that putting one woman on a hiring committee will solve the problem. What works in here, again, the practice that is very widespread in the UK of anonymous marking is one of the best means to ensure fairness all over. And I don't know, can we talk about the field cards, the exam boards? So, I think it's okay, right? So, we assess your work anonymously almost throughout the degree, maybe with the exception of, not with the exception of extended essays. With the exception, I guess, of MA work where the numbers, or if the numbers are very small. But often when we make decisions about the final degree classification, we do that only using the student number. So again, it's entirely anonymized and unbiased. And then when we reveal the names of the students in their final classification, there's often an enormous surprise where we think, oh, actually, you know, I know so-and-so, and he or she is very nice, and I wish I would. But then the whole point is that it's done anonymously. So these kinds of considerations, which are the kind of natural psychological reaction you might have once you know the name of the person, aren't allowed to sort of interfere with the deliberative process. So I hope this makes sense. So we anonymize where possible, extensively in marking, but also in some parts of the hiring process, and as Richard mentioned, peer reviewing. But also keeping awareness of the possible risks of anonymizing. So if women are, for example, are the subject of implicit bias extensively throughout their career, then naturally they'll have fewer publications, they'll have fewer conference presentations, they will have been invited to be keynote fewer times, and so their CV will look less good than that of a man in the equivalent position, more or less. So then, one risk of anonymization is that the CVs will just look weaker. So simply anonymizing without reflecting on the entire kind of career trajectory of someone isn't enough. Another thing that works is spend time thinking about counter-stereotypical examples. So I asked professors in experimental psychology, they didn't recognize a single person from this photo, so I think we can get like free biscuit to whoever. Does anybody recognize any of the semantic info?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Martin as well.
Mm-hmm. She was here in June. Okay, shall we unveil? So it's Simone Weil, Daniel Allen, Martin Nussbaum, Laura Neal, Simone de Beauvoir, Ken Taylor, and Ray Langton. Richard should get this. Other things at work, again, if you're ever in a position of making decisions about hiring, being in a rush and being hungry, are the kinds of things that make people make shortcuts that might activate these kinds of implicit bias, these kinds of psychological mechanisms. Can you skip? Okay, so maybe more relevant to you is when you think about teaching. Again, it'd be interesting actually to hear your thoughts. Have you noticed, or when you reflect on it now, have you ever gotten the sense that women's contributions are overlooked or attributed to men, or that women are interrupted more readily? I'm really interested to hear what your experiences are as being on the receiving end of big students. Does this strike you? Yeah.
I think, especially when I was an undergrad in quite a small lecture group, the lecturer would often refer to me and a friend as girls, hi girls, but I don't think he would ever refer to the men as boys. And I think it was this kind of language, and I think that was something that was quite noticeable. A lot was he'd be like, what do you think, girls?
Right, okay.
So that was something.
Okay, that's...
I've noticed in the attitude whenever in my first degree women had to talk, they had to talk louder, they had to kind of struggle. The attitude was of a struggling attitude, trying to make their voice being heard.
I was talking with other colleagues and PhD students, and we were talking about this topic, and they told me like we try to not to read the name of the writer, and it works. But then when we look at it unconsciously, the idea about the article, the essay changes.
How will you reveal the...
Even if they already read it, when they reveal it, they change, like,
it makes you
the
reassess.
perspective. Yeah. So, and I was like, they were aware, but they were there.
Yeah. Just jump in.
At the school I work at, so this is not higher education, but still education, the majority of the students happen to be male. And especially in the classes where there's maybe one or two girls, even the teachers don't tend to ask the girls for questions. The girls tend to sit at the back really quiet, and they just won't say anything. And the teacher doesn't challenge it, which is not really good to see.
For like all position elections, like all the residents of the JCR committee, because the person who's actually president was ill, I ended up attending a thing for all the presidents for all the JCRs. Such a huge majority was male, and I feel that that's because people have been associating certain sort of things, despite the candidacy being probably quite even, especially if I'm looking at our own elections, just male candidates viewed as more competent.
Thanks. What else? Yeah.
I've noticed, in most seminars, in most units I've done, that even when even numbers of men and women in there, that men tend to speak more and interrupt more. And I don't think it's necessarily even the person, what they call, leading the seminars, doing it. It's kind of ingrained roles and habits of how people talk. And I think one way that I've sometimes seen that can change that is kind of encouraging people to put up their hands and do that instead of just people just freely talking and having to fight their way into the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth bearing in mind that these things will feed each other, the stereotype. I mean, there's a little bit of how we already said that stereotype threat and implicit bias will interact, and they'll feed each other in that sort of way. So if you come in already with the, the person from the group that's underrepresented comes in already feeling the effects of stereotype threat, they will naturally be less confident, because that's exactly what the effect of stereotype threat is. And then that will feed the sort of stereotyping done by the leader of the seminar, and that will go kind of back and forward. So there's a sort of vicious feedback loop that's involved in these things. That sort of thing that you're saying. It's not sometimes someone begins by not, calling them someone because they seem to have been quiet. They may well have been quiet exactly because they're suffering from stereotype threat aspect of it. And also, I think one of the things I said earlier about the student elections, when we've been talking, I guess, about academic stereotyping people as not being good at academic work, and that's obviously a stereotype to lots of groups. But not being good at leadership work is another one that lots of groups have, partly because of the constitution of the leadership roles in the world that you see. And a lot of the stereotypes that you get because of what you see the world being like, because of the status quo. So your stereotype for what the CEO of a major company looks like, you'll have got from seeing the CEO being a 50-year-old white man every single time you see one on the television. That will build up the stereotype, regardless of what your views are about sort of equality and so on. And so that's exactly the same thing with leadership. If your picture of someone in a leadership role, a CEO or a politician or something, is consistently a white man of a certain age, then that's now the picture that's in your head. And if someone comes before you going for a leadership role who doesn't look like that picture, then immediately you'll think there's something wrong, not because you're overtly sexist necessarily, but because that stereotype's been sort of internalized for you.